Hello, my name is Casey Sean Harmon, and this is my new book, The Everafter Chronicles, Reign of the Night Creatures, available wherever books are sold by Tate Publishing. Today I'm going to read you the first chapter of this book. I hope you enjoy. Chapter 1, The Sundog. Ye had better surrender the booty, mates, or else it's off to Davy Jones's locker with you, the pirate said, swinging his sword in the air. The children weren't about to surrender. Heavens no. They had discovered the doubloon all on their own, which meant that it was rightfully theirs. No, go away, you mean man, young Susan said. She huddled closely to James, the oldest of the three children. Go away, Papa will be here soon to take care of you. The ugly pirate laughed. Your Papa is nowhere to be found, me sweetie. He looked at Susan and snarled. And by thunder, I'm glad I don't have to worry about that wretched dog of yours anymore. Why did the pirate have to mention Clovensport? Poor, brave Clovensport, lost out there all alone. The pirate laughed a most dreadful laugh. Face it, you're only children, and there ain't nothing you can do to stop me. All three children stepped back as the pirate edged his way closer. They were on a narrow bridge, and it was a sheer drop. The bridge swung back and forth as the pirate waved his sword again. I'm getting tired of arguing. Just then there was a very loud sound that filled the air with vibrations. It sounded very much like a cow's moo, except that it was much deeper and without the M sound. Imagine, if you will, an oo. The children covered their ears. The pirate, all in a split second, had to decide whether he would sacrifice his sword to cover his ears or try and hold the sword and cover his ears at the same time. He chose the latter and, upon whacking off his ear, flew into a frenzy and toppled off the side of the bridge. When the loud sound had ended, the children uncovered their ears and looked down to see the pirate, who was by now a mere speck, spinning to his death. They smiled at each other and then turned their attention to figuring out what had made that strange sound. Well, it was really pointless thinking about it. Nothing in that strange world made much sense. They staggered off the bridge and sat on some rocks to think things over. How had they come to be in such a place? It really made no sense. One fine summer's day they were bored at home, and the next minute they were here. Charlotte, who was 13, liked to spend most of her time reading. She was the shyest of the bunch, easygoing, and never ever raised her voice. James, 15, had plenty of friends, but most of them were found on public chat rooms on the internet. He enjoyed watching movies, especially ones about wizards and dragons. Young Susan, 6, was the smartest kid in her class at school. She would often preoccupy herself with puzzles and mind-challenging games. Her favorite was Sudoku. This was a normal Saturday. The Peterson house was a quiet house. The children kept to themselves, doing their own thing. About the only time there was movement was when James and Charlotte would fix lunch for everyone. It was usually peanut butter and jelly, the children's favorite. The house was lively then, but after mealtime, it would become quiet again. Grumpy old Mrs. Knoll, who lived next door, once thought the children were depressed. I declare I never saw such a calm, quiet group of children in all my life, she said. But she had learned to accept the fact that the children were just different. The children's parents were rarely seen. In these days, people had to work hard to have decent themes. It was unfortunate that so much work meant little time left over for family. About the only time their parents were ever home was at night. The rest of the time it was up to James to watch out for the girls, and for each of them to watch out for one another. They were never apart. Even at school, they stuck together any chance they got. This day was like any other day, except that Susan was a bit more anxious than usual. For some reason, Sudoku wasn't the game on her mind. In fact, all she wanted to do was sit at the living room window and stare out at the sky. It was a beautiful day. The skies were beautiful, and there were big white clouds here and there. She spent the longest time making out shapes in the clouds. She found a rocket ship, a sea star, and a funny-looking dragon. She even found what looked like Abraham Lincoln's face, proudly gazing over the rugged landscape in the distance. But of all these wonderful shapes, nothing was more fascinating than the Sundog. In case you have never heard of a Sundog, It is a patch of light reflecting off a cloud. People often confuse sundogs for the sun. The sundog was bright and large, and the strange thing was that it seemed to be slowly moving, not with the clouds, but in a direction all of its own. Susan watched it closely. It was incredibly hard to tell if it was really moving in a direction of its own, or if it's simply a trick of the eye. After a moment, she decided that it was, in fact, a free-moving sundog. But how could this be? She turned and called for her older brother. James lazily pulled away from the computer and went to her side. Susan pointed. "You see that sundog up there? It's moving opposite the clouds. How is it doing that, James?" James studied the sundog for a moment and decided that it must be something different entirely. "It's strange, whatever it is. Look, doesn't it seem to be getting bigger?" By this time, Charlotte was with them, and all three children stared out the window at the sky. "It is getting bigger, James," Charlotte said, "and it's coming this way." Clovensport, half German shepherd, half who knows what, was by nature a quiet dog. He was always easy to forget, hiding beneath tables and at the foot of beds. The dog made his presence known by running up to the window, pointing his nose, and in a manner quite unlike himself, uttered an ear-shattering woof, woof, and then a grrr. The window was vibrating. The children, eyes fixed toward the sundog that was now hovering just outside the window, slowly gazed outward. "Is it a ghost?" little Susan asked, tugging on James' pant leg. "There's no such thing as ghosts," James said, in an almost doubtful manner. The glowing circle hovered back and forth outside the window. After only a few seconds, the circle began to grow brighter and brighter until it became too bright for the children to look at. "Cover your eyes," James yelled to his siblings, drawing them into his chest. The sound of the window vibrating was by now very loud. But in an instant, the sound ended, and the children could tell that the room had gotten dark. Little Susan was the first to look up. Her little heart began to race as her eyes grew very large. She wanted to scream, but nothing would come out. When the other two children looked up, they began to shudder with great fear. Hovering in the same room that they were standing in was the glowing circle. Only now it was very dim, like someone had turned out its light. Charlotte glanced up at James and whispered, "What should we do?" James still had his arms wrapped around his sisters. The girls could feel his heart beating against their faces. James knew that because he was the oldest, it was his responsibility to make sure his sisters were taken care of. He had never been in a situation like this before, and he felt very unsure of himself. He studied the glowing circle. It was hovering about 5 feet above the floor, perfectly motionless, as if someone had hung it from the ceiling by a string. He wondered if the object had a brain of its own, and if it was staring at them that very moment. "This is most curious," he said. "I have never heard of anything like this ever happening before. People make up stuff like this and write about it in storybooks." He let go of his sisters and walked toward the telephone. "I think we should call Mama and Papa." The children gathered around the phone as James dialed their parents. Clovensport lay in the living room next to the sofa, staring up at the glowing circle as if to protect the children from harm. James made several calls but was unable to contact their parents. After the last call, he slammed down the phone. "Why won't they answer?" he yelled. He then turned to call their grandparents. The phone just rang and rang. He tried calling the aunts and the uncles, his history teachers, Mrs. Knoll next door, and his friend Bobby. But he even tried dialing random numbers just to see if he could get a hold of somebody. After several minutes of trying, James finally gave up. "There's something wrong with the phone." "I think we should walk next door to Mrs. Knoll's house," Charlotte suggested. The children walked to the front door. But when Charlotte went to try to open it, the knob would not turn. "Why isn't the doorknob turning?" she asked James with a fearful look on her face. "Let me try," James said, reaching for the knob. Sure enough, it was stuck. James tried to hide his emotions from his sisters. However, the girls could tell by the look on his face that he was very worried. James walked across the house to the back door. It wouldn't open either. He went around to all the windows and tried to open them, but it was as if they had all been bolted down from the outside. At last he grew angry and went to the kitchen and picked up one of his mother's skillets. He threw the skillet at the dining room window and watched in disbelief as the skillet bounced as if the window were made out of rubber. James sat down on the sofa. "I don't know what to do," he cried. The girls sat down beside him, and together they stared in front of them at the glowing circle, which had not moved since it had entered the house. Susan, who had been very quiet through all this, decided that it was her turn to make a suggestion. "Why don't we ask it what it wants?" she said. And without giving her siblings time to reply, she looked at the glowing circle and asked, "What do you want?" Immediately, the children began to hear noises coming from the dining room behind them. When they turned to see what was happening, they could not believe their eyes. They watched as 4 of the 5 chairs that were sitting around the dining room table began to slide across the floor until they came to a stop in a perfect line side by side in front of the glowing circle. Susan smiled. "I told you, it's trying to talk to us." The children rose to their feet. "I wonder what it is trying to tell us," James said. "Maybe it's like a game of charades and we have to guess what it is saying." "Okay then," James said, rubbing his shin. "There are 4 chairs, 4 wooden chairs. Wasn't there a boy in school whose last name was Chairwood?" Charlotte looked over at the chairs and then she sat back down on the sofa. "I think I know what it is trying to tell us," she said. "I think it wants us to sit down on the chairs." "Well, what will happen when we do?" James said. "I don't know if we should trust this thing. The object has us caged here. Maybe the only way to escape is to do what it wants. I don't know what else to do." James looked each of his sisters in the eye and then looked over at the glowing circle. "Charlotte may be right," he thought. "Maybe this is the only way." He looked back over at his sisters. "I think we should try it," he said, "but I want to be the first to sit down." The girls watched as James hesitantly took a seat in one of the chairs. The room was very silent for a few seconds until James opened his eyes and assured the girls that he was okay. "I wonder why nothing happened," James said. "Maybe we should all sit down at once," Charlotte suggested. "Come on, Susan, let's take a seat." The girls held hands, and after counting to 3, they both sat down at the same time. The children looked around at each other and realized that nothing had happened. "What are we doing wrong?" Charlotte cried, burying her face in her hands. Minutes passed while the children thought. They had tried everything, yet nothing seemed to make sense. Little Susan looked around at the chairs and then looked up at the glowing circle. "I really wish I could figure out what to do," she thought. And then she thought about what she would do if this were a number puzzle. She looked back around at the chairs. There is one empty chair, she thought. "I wonder who that chair is for." Susan looked at her siblings. "Who is missing?" she said. "How come we have an empty chair?" James and Charlotte thought a second, and then James said, "I think you're onto something, little sis." They gazed around the room for possible clues to the puzzle. It wasn't long before Susan laughed. She stood up and walked over to the sofa. "It must be for Clovensport," she said, bending over and picking up the dog. Clovensport seemed a little nervous about Susan moving him closer to the mysterious glowing circle. However, he cooperated without a fight. She sat Clovensport in the 4th chair, and the instant she sat back down in her own chair, the lights went out. That's the first chapter of my new book, The Everafter Chronicles, Reign of the Night Creatures. If you want to know what happens next, you have to read it. Thanks for listening.